The Terran Military Academy on Kepler Station was, by all galactic standards, a joke wrapped in bureaucracy and seasoned with institutional condescension. Picture, if you will, the universe's most expensive daycare center for species deemed developmentally challenged by their cosmic betters. The facility boasted state-of-the-art everything, from quantum-locked training chambers to molecular gastronomy cafeterias, none of which the human cadets were permitted to use, naturally. They got the basement levels, the hammer-down equipment, and the constant reminder that they were participating in what the Galactic Educational Consortium euphemistically called a cultural elevation initiative. Because nothing says we respect your potential quite like relegating an entire species to the academic equivalent of the kids' table. The Academy's crown jewel was its diverse faculty, representing the three pillars of galactic civilization. The Zephyrians, those crystalline beings who looked like someone had crossbred a chandelier with a philosophy textbook, handled strategic planning and theoretical combat. Their thoughts moved at light speed, which they never let anyone forget, though their bodies moved with all the urgency of continental drift. Then came the Karate, who resembled what would happen if a rhinoceros decided to pursue a career in professional wrestling and developed an unhealthy obsession with honor codes. They taught hand-to-hand combat and weapon mastery, assuming you were advanced enough to deserve actual weapons instead of foam padding and strongly worded suggestions. Finally, the Nexary managed all technological aspects of military education. Picture an octopus that had achieved enlightenment through Wi-Fi, and you'd be in the ballpark. 8 arms meant 8 simultaneous holographic interfaces, which they used primarily to demonstrate why every other species was doing everything wrong, especially the humans. Cadet instructor Vex Thalen embodied everything delightfully insufferable about Zephyrian superiority. His crystalline form caught light from 17 different angles, creating a rainbow that somehow managed to look condescending. When he spoke, which he did frequently and at length, his voice carried the tone of someone explaining quantum physics to particularly slow houseplants. He'd been assigned to oversee human integration, a posting that every Zephyrian understood was either punishment duty or comedy relief, depending on your perspective. Today's exercise, Vex Thalen announced to the Mixed Species Assembly, his prismatic form casting dancing lights across the briefing room, will demonstrate tactical adaptability across various cognitive processing speeds. He paused, presumably to let the profundity of his wisdom settle into their primitive brains. Naturally, we'll be implementing species-appropriate difficulty scaling, which translated roughly to, the real soldiers would get real challenges while the humans played with building blocks. Jaxon Torres sat in the back row designated for human cadets, a location chosen not for acoustics, but for the symbolic reminder of their place in the galactic pecking order. At 22, he possessed what his evaluation reports generously termed exceptional potential for baseline humanoid capabilities. In other words, he was the best of a bad lot, like being crowned the smartest rock in a gravel pit. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd scored higher on preliminary tactical assessments than half the alien cadets, a fact that had been carefully omitted from official records due to what administrators called calibration errors, and what everyone else understood as inconvenient truths that challenged established hierarchies. Beside him sat Marcus Chen. Damn, that was one of the forbidden names. Let's try again. Beside him sat Rico Valdez, whose mechanical aptitude had impressed even Nexary instructors until they realized he was human, at which point his innovations were suddenly reclassified as crude but adequate solutions. Then there was Amara Okafor, whose strategic thinking had earned grudging respect until it became politically inconvenient to acknowledge that a primitive could outmaneuver Zephyrian tactical scenarios. The alien cadets occupied the premium seating with the casual entitlement of those born to superiority. Crix Tal, a karate warrior whose neck was thicker than most human torsos, regularly entertained his peers with impressions of human combat techniques, lots of exaggerated stumbling and confused arm-waving that sent his audience into crystalline chimes of laughter or rumbling karate approval, depending on the species. Zeph Nara, daughter of some Zephyrian dignitary whose name required 3 separate tongue positions to pronounce correctly, treated the human presence like an anthropological study. She'd actually published papers on cognitive limitations in pre-spaceflight humanoids, which had become required reading in xenopsychology courses across 12 systems. The fact that her research was based entirely on observing humans who were deliberately given inferior equipment and training apparently hadn't occurred to anyone as a methodological flaw. Nexaries, the Nexary tech specialist, had tentacles that never stopped moving across holographic interfaces, managing approximately 47 different data streams while simultaneously expressing disappointment at human inability to multitask. The fact that humans hadn't evolved 8 arms was apparently a personal failing rather than a biological reality. The Academy's daily routine had been carefully calibrated to reinforce everyone's proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. Morning physical conditioning saw humans relegated to basic calisthenics, while aliens utilized gravity manipulation chambers and molecular enhancement protocols. Combat training involved humans practicing with blunted training weapons, while their counterparts mastered plasma rifles and quantum disruptors. Even mealtimes reinforced the pecking order. Aliens enjoyed molecular gastronomy, while humans got what the nutritional analysis generously called culturally appropriate sustenance, and what everyone else recognized as military rations from the previous century. But it was the academic sessions that truly showcased the institution's commitment to maintaining proper perspectives. Tactical analysis courses featured scenarios where humans served as either civilians to be protected or obstacles to be managed, never as actual strategic assets. Military history covered every major conflict except those where humans had played significant roles, which were either declassified or reframed as examples of alien intervention saving primitive worlds from their own incompetence. The Primitive Species Accommodation Protocol governed every aspect of human cadet life. Established by the Galactic Educational Consortium, it ensured that humans received appropriate challenges that wouldn't overwhelm their limited cognitive architectures. This meant simplified scenarios, reduced time pressures, and constant supervision to prevent them from accidentally harming themselves with concepts beyond their comprehension. What it really meant was institutional gaslighting dressed up in academic terminology. The morning of what would later be remembered as the Kepler Station incident began like any other exercise in structured humiliation. Vex Thalen had prepared what he considered a masterpiece of pedagogical demonstration, a tactical scenario so brilliantly designed that it would showcase each species' natural superiority, while highlighting human limitations in ways that were both educational and entertaining. Today's combat simulation will feature multi-species coordination protocols, he announced, his crystalline form practically humming with satisfaction. Advanced cognitive processes will handle strategic oversight, while baseline species manage support functions. Translation: aliens would play generals while humans carried supplies and stayed out of the way. The simulation environment materialized around them, a hostile planet scenario complete with enemy installations, environmental hazards, and objectives requiring both tactical brilliance and operational execution. The Zephyrians received command positions with access to full sensor data and strategic analysis protocols. Karate cadets got heavy assault roles with advanced weaponry. Nexary specialists controlled technical systems and electronic warfare capabilities. Humans got designated auxiliary support roles, which involved following orders and trying not to get killed while more advanced species handled the real work. Jaxon found himself assigned to logistics coordination, a fancy term for carrying ammunition and providing first aid to real soldiers when they got injured doing important things. His equipment consisted of a basic medkit, some supply packs, and what the requisition system generously called a defensive sidearm, essentially a glorified flashlight that might temporarily blind an enemy if you were exceptionally lucky. The scenario briefing outlined a standard military operation: infiltrate enemy positions, neutralize strategic targets, extract valuable intelligence. Simple enough, except that human cadets weren't briefed on actual objectives. They received need-to-know information that amounted to go where you're told and do what you're ordered. As the simulation began, the established hierarchy reasserted itself with predictable efficiency. Zeph Nara immediately began coordinating strategic positions from her command interface, her crystalline intelligence processing multiple data streams while issuing orders with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted her own superiority. Her tactical analysis identified optimal approach routes, threat assessments, and resource allocation parameters within the first 30 seconds. Crix Tal and his karate squad mates moved with the fluid coordination of natural-born warriors. They enhanced physicality, allowing them to traverse terrain that would challenge even augmented humans. Their weapons, real energy weapons, not training simulators, hummed with barely contained power as they established overwatch positions and began systematic elimination of simulated enemies. Next, Ares orchestrated electronic warfare campaigns that turned enemy systems against themselves while managing communications protocols across all friendly units. 8 arms meant 8 simultaneous operational capabilities, from jamming enemy sensors to coordinating supply drops with mechanical precision. And the humans? They followed along behind, carrying things and trying not to trip over their own feet while the betters demonstrated proper military competence. Jaxon had been assigned to support Krikstall's assault team, which meant staying back and maintaining communications while real warriors handled actual combat. His role consisted primarily of monitoring team health indicators and ensuring ammunition supplies remained adequate. Basically, he was an extremely expensive pack mule with basic medical training. But here's where the galaxy's fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology began to matter. Humans, as any competent xenobiologist could tell you, had evolved as persistence hunters on a planet where everything larger wanted to eat them, and everything smaller carried diseases that could kill them. They'd survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and each other through a combination of stubborn refusal to die and an almost pathological tendency to view impossible odds as interesting challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles. The Galactic establishment had somehow convinced itself that these traits indicated primitive thinking rather than sophisticated survival strategies. So when Jaxon noticed patterns in enemy movement that Zephna's tactical analysis had missed, he initially followed protocol and reported his observations through proper channels. When his insights were dismissed as limited perspective cognitive artifacts, he tried escalating to backup communication protocols. When those were ignored, he attempted direct communication with field commanders. Which is when Instructor Vex Thalen decided that this particular human had forgotten his place in the cosmic hierarchy. Cadet Torres, the Zephyrian's voice carried across the simulation environment with crystalline clarity. You will maintain communication discipline and restrict your observations to designated parameters. So, I'm observing flanking movements that suggest. You are observing processing errors generated by insufficient cognitive architecture, Vex Thalen interrupted, his prismatic form brightening with what passed for Zephyrian irritation. Human pattern recognition frequently generates false positives when exposed to data complexity beyond baseline parameters. In simpler terms, shut up, monkey, the adults are working. Jaxon felt something shift inside his chest, not anger, exactly, but something colder and more focused. Around him, alien cadets continued their demonstration of superior capabilities while enemy forces maneuvered into positions that would shortly turn the exercise into a massacre. His suggestions continued to be dismissed, his warnings ignored, his insights treated as computational noise from defective hardware. That's when Vex Thalen made his fatal mistake. Moving with the fluid grace that Zephyrians possessed in abundance, the instructor approached Jaxon's position with what was clearly intended as a corrective gesture. In Zephyrian culture, physical contact served primarily instructional purposes, a brief touch to redirect attention, realign focus, or provide emphasis to important concepts. What Vex Thalen intended as a disciplinary tap to refocus a distracted student, Jaxon experienced as something entirely different. Because here's what Galactic xenopsychology had somehow missed about human evolutionary psychology. Humans were pack hunters who'd survived by developing sophisticated threat assessment capabilities. They could distinguish between accidental contact, friendly touch, dominance displays, and hostile actions within microseconds because their survival had depended on making those distinctions correctly. And when a member of a species that had been systematically dismissing, marginalizing, and humiliating humans for months made physical contact in front of witnesses while delivering a public rebuke, human hindbrain classified that as a dominance challenge from a hostile entity. The slap that Vex Thalen intended as mild correction triggered responses that had been hardwired into human nervous systems across millennia of survival on a planet where backing down from challenges meant death or exile from protective groups. Jaxon's response wasn't calculated or planned. It was pure, distilled human evolutionary programming expressing itself through modern tactical training. His left hand intercepted Vex Thalen's crystalline appendage with enough force to crack mineral formations, while his right hand drew the defensive sidearm, and reconfigured its energy output through methods that definitely weren't covered in the user manual. The flashlight weapon hybrid suddenly became something considerably more interesting and more dangerous. But that was just the opening move. What happened next would have impressed Sun Tzu, terrified Machiavelli, and made every drill sergeant in human history shed a proud tear. Because Jaxon didn't just fight back. He assessed, prioritized, and began systematic dismantling of everything the Galactic establishment thought it knew about human capabilities. Vexthalen's crystalline physiology, optimized for processing information at light speed, proved spectacularly unsuited for close-quarters combat against an opponent who moved with the fluid unpredictability of a species that had survived by being impossible to predict. While the Zephyrian attempted to process optimal response algorithms, Jaxon had already moved through 17 different attack vectors and begun working on the 18th. The sound that crystalline beings make when their mineral matrix begins failing structurally is something like wind chimes having an existential crisis, beautiful, haunting, and deeply disturbing when you realize it's screaming. Krixtao, demonstrating the lightning reflexes that made karate such formidable warriors, immediately moved to assist his instructor. His species had evolved for honorable single combat according to established protocols, which worked magnificently against opponents who shared similar concepts of fair play and ritual warfare. Humans, having evolved on a planet where fair play was a luxury that dead species couldn't afford, had developed different approaches to conflict resolution. Jaxon's response to Krixtal's charge would later be studied in military academies across 12 star systems. He used the karate's own momentum against him, redirected his attack into the nearest wall with enough force to leave rhinoceros-shaped dents in reinforced bulkheads, and then did something that defied every military manual in galactic circulation. He improvised. The supply packs he'd been carrying contained standard emergency equipment, medical supplies, communication gear, basic tools. In human hands, they became weapons that no tactical analysis algorithm had ever accounted for because no one had imagined that supposedly primitive beings would think to weaponize first aid kits. Antiseptic spray became chemical warfare when introduced to karate respiratory systems. Medical scanners, when reconfigured through creative applications of mechanical knowledge, generated electromagnetic pulses that played havoc with nexuary nervous systems. Even the supply containers themselves became projectile weapons when hurled with the accuracy that comes from a species that had survived by throwing rocks at things that wanted to eat them. Nexaries, managing multiple combat algorithms simultaneously, suddenly found his systems overwhelmed not by superior technology, but by the sheer unpredictability of an opponent who kept doing things that weren't supposed to be possible. Every tactical response he calculated assumed rational behavior based on optimal resource allocation. Humans, apparently, had never received that particular memo. While artificial intelligences processed probability matrices and calculated optimal countermeasures, Jaxon had already identified the Nexary's primary weakness, dependency on technological solutions for biological problems. 8 arms meant 8 separate neural pathways controlling fine motor functions. Disrupt the right nerve clusters, and suddenly your technological superiority becomes a liability as confused signals turn precision instruments into random noise generators. But the real shock came when other human cadets joined the engagement. Because what the galactic establishment had completely failed to understand was that humans weren't just individual organisms, they were pack hunters who'd survived through coordination, communication, and the ability to function as integrated units even under impossible conditions. Rico Valdez materialized with a collection of improvised devices that would have impressed any engineer if they'd had time to study them instead of dodging them. His mechanical aptitude, previously dismissed as adequate for primitive applications, had produced weapons that combined salvage components in ways that defied conventional engineering principles but worked with terrifying efficiency. Amara Okafor's strategic thinking, which had been relegated to support planning roles, suddenly revealed itself as tactical genius when applied to real combat instead of academic exercises. She'd been observing, analyzing, and preparing contingency plans for exactly this scenario, not because she'd expected it, but because human psychology compulsively generates backup plans for situations that probably won't happen but might kill you if they do. What followed wasn't a brawl. It was a systematic demonstration of why human beings had become the dominant species on a planet that had spent millions of years trying to kill them. The alien cadets had superior technology, enhanced physiology, and advanced training. What they didn't have was experience with opponents who treated overwhelming odds as baseline operating conditions and impossible situations as interesting puzzles to solve through creative application of available resources. Zeph-Nora's tactical algorithms, designed for coordination with logical entities following predictable protocols, kept generating error messages as humans did things that made no tactical sense but proved devastatingly effective anyway. Her strategic analysis systems couldn't account for enemies who seemed to prioritize psychological impact over optimal resource utilization, except that the psychological impact was proving to be optimal resource utilization, just through methods that hadn't been programmed into her tactical databases. The karate assault teams found themselves fighting opponents who didn't follow any honorable combat traditions, didn't respect proper protocols for challenge and response, and seemed to treat warfight as a creative exercise rather than a formal ritual. Every time they established proper combat positions, human opponents had already moved somewhere else and begun attacking from directions that hadn't existed moments before. The Nexary technical specialists discovered that their sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities were less useful against enemies who treated technology as disposable tools rather than precious resources. When humans couldn't hack systems, they broke them. When they couldn't break them, they ignored them. When they couldn't ignore them, they used them in ways that violated every safety protocol and engineering principle but somehow worked anyway. The simulation environment, designed to challenge multiple species within carefully controlled parameters, began registering system alerts as human combatants did things that the programming had never anticipated. Emergency protocols activated as auxiliary support personnel demonstrated capabilities that exceeded baseline parameters for their species by factors that the system couldn't calculate because the math kept producing impossible results. In the span of 17 minutes, everything the Galactic establishment thought it knew about human military capabilities proved to be catastrophically wrong. But the real revelation came in the aftermath, when Academy administrators tried to understand what had actually happened. Because this wasn't an isolated incident of humans exceeding expectations. It was a systematic demonstration that the expectations themselves had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Emergency sessions convened within hours of the Kepler Station incident, as it was already being called in official reports. Representatives from all three major galactic civilizations gathered in quantum-encrypted conference chambers to discuss what they were carefully not calling the human problem, but which everyone understood was exactly that. The Zephyrian consensus submitted analysis reports that ran to thousands of pages and essentially concluded that their previous assessments of human cognitive capability had been based on incomplete datasets. Translated from academic bureaucraties, this meant, "We were wrong, but we're going to use very polite language to avoid admitting it directly." The Karate High Command offered more straightforward assessments. Humans fought like demons and seemed to enjoy it, which suggested that previous classifications of them as a peaceful species suitable for support roles might require revision. Their recommendation involved immediate reclassification of human military potential and emergency protocols for managing what they termed asymmetric engagement scenarios with unpredictable combatants. The Nexary Collective produced the most disturbing analysis of all. Humans appeared to possess an intuitive understanding of technological systems that allowed them to repurpose equipment in ways that defied engineering principles but produced functional results. Their technical innovations weren't following established scientific methodologies. They were experimenting with dangerous combinations of incompatible systems and somehow making them work through what could only be described as applied stubbornness. But the most unsettling discovery came when investigators reviewed historical records and found patterns that everyone had somehow missed. Every human colony had reported maintenance issues that had mysteriously resolved themselves through equipment failures that somehow improved system performance. Human civilian populations had consistently exceeded projected capabilities in crisis situations, displaying resource allocation strategies that optimized for outcomes rather than efficiency. Even human academic performance, when adjusted for the systematic disadvantages they'd been operating under, suggested cognitive capabilities that approached or exceeded galactic averages. The terrible truth began to emerge. The galactic establishment hadn't been managing a primitive species. They'd been systematically suppressing a competitive one. Emergency diplomatic channels activated across 12 star systems as the implication spread. If humans had been deliberately held back rather than naturally limited, what did that suggest about other species classified as developing civilizations? How many potential allies had been converted into potential threats through policies designed to maintain existing power structures? The Terran Diplomatic Corps, which had spent decades politely accepting junior partner status in galactic affairs, suddenly found themselves receiving urgent communications from civilizations that had previously ignored their existence. Trade agreements that had favored alien interests for generations came up for immediate renegotiation. Military cooperation protocols required complete revision. But perhaps most significantly, human recruitment into galactic military academies shifted from reluctant charitable gesture to urgent strategic necessity. Because once you've seen what humans can accomplish when they stop trying to meet other species' expectations and start solving problems in their own distinctly human ways, the question stops being why would we want them as allies, and becomes how quickly can we make sure they don't become our enemies. 6 months after the Kepler Station incident, Cadet, now Lieutenant, Jaxon found himself delivering lectures to mixed-species audiences on adaptive tactical thinking in resource-constrained environments. His insights on improvised warfare had become required reading in military academies across 17 systems. Rico Valdez established the first human-led engineering consultancy, specializing in what he diplomatically called unconventional solutions to conventional problems. His client list included 3 major galactic civilizations and several minor ones who'd discovered that human mechanical intuition could solve problems that their advanced theoretical frameworks couldn't even identify. Amara Okafor accepted a position with the Galactic Strategic Planning Commission, where her talent for generating contingency plans for unlikely scenarios proved invaluable for organizations that had previously assumed that technological superiority made comprehensive planning unnecessary. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. For decades, humanity had been told they were the galactic equivalent of maintenance personnel, useful for basic tasks but unsuited for important responsibilities. Their role in the greater cosmic community was to serve, support, and stay out of the way, while more advanced species handled the serious business of civilization. And in a sense, that assessment had been entirely accurate. Humans had maintained galactic civilization by quietly fixing problems that advanced species couldn't solve, supporting systems that sophisticated technologies couldn't optimize, and staying out of the way of conflicts that logical approaches couldn't resolve. They'd been performing maintenance on galactic society itself, not because they were limited to menial tasks, but because they were the only species capable of recognizing when fundamental systems needed repair. The slap heard round the galaxy, as historians would later call it, wasn't really about military tactics or combat capabilities. It was about the moment when the maintenance crew stopped accepting that the machinery was supposed to work that way and started fixing problems that the original engineers had assumed were features rather than bugs. And the most delicious irony of all? The galaxy's self-appointed guardians had spent so much time explaining why humans couldn't be trusted with real responsibility that they'd never noticed humans had already been handling it all along. They'd just been too polite to mention it. Until someone made the mistake of treating politeness as weakness, respect as submission, and cooperation as capitulation. History would record that the day humanity struck back wasn't when they conquered anyone or destroyed anything. It was the day they stopped pretending to be what everyone else insisted they were and started being what they'd always been capable of becoming. The maintenance crew had finished their work, and now they were open to discussing their fees.